Hello everyone, welcome to the Evangelist Nick Garrett channel. Today I'm going to invite you to subscribe to John Washington's YouTube channel. That's the channel that I will use to post videos about the new book, Shipwrecked in the Land of King Tobacco. You can subscribe via the link in the description. Shipwrecked in the Land of King Tobacco, the first Washington family immigrant to America, opens with a vignette during which John's mother is fearfully looking out the window to make sure one of many real-life fears will not impact their family that day. Oliver Cromwell and his parliamentarians routing out royalists. Matthew Hopkins and witch hunters coming through the countryside for victims and seeing if the church was bringing money with which to feed the Washington children. Meanwhile, John Washington's father, the Reverend Dr. Lawrence, had spent his whole life advancing his career inside the royalist machinery of King Charles I as a cleric at Oxford University. For a time, he was one of Archbishop William Laud's henchmen, helping him to expel Puritans from universities. Soon Lawrence Washington's life took a dramatic turn, though. He started a family in secret and against the rules of his position at Oxford with Amphialus Twigden. After getting married, John Washington and his mother moved when Lawrence became rector of an opulent parish. The royalist machinery was well enough at work to gain a scholar's place for John to Oxford when the time came. In the meantime, young John Washington was sent to Thomas Sutton's hospital and school. Conditions in England continued to decline for royalists, and as the Washington family grew, more separation and further demotions for Lawrence brought suffering to the family. At some point, John decided against becoming a scholar at Oxford and followed many to the sea as a merchant to trade goods. John went into business after completing a period of apprenticeship. He took to sea as a merchant. In February of 1655, he arrived in the bustling trade city of London. He was there to prove his mother's will. Since meeting young John Washington, by 1655 his mother, father, and step-grandfather were all dead. While in London, John received a letter from the prominent merchant and seafarer Edward Prescott offering him a partnership interest in a Dutch-rigged ketch called the Seahorse of London. John placed his brother Lawrence in charge of his affairs and headed off to Danzig, Poland, modern-day Gdansk. The Seahorse of London disembarked and used the canals and tributaries all through Europe to fill the ship with goods that they will cross the Atlantic with for Barbados and Virginia to sell and trade. Tobacco is really what they were after. By then, sweet-scented tobacco from the mid-Atlantic had become an international cash crop. Their intention was to load up with tobacco and return to London to begin the cycle all over again. John proved himself as a master sailor and tradesman, easily taking a leadership role and splitting equal responsibilities with Captain Prescott. The crew were amazed by the economic engine they saw in Virginia centered on tobacco. They were also well aware of the tumultuous history that had taken place over the previous 50 years. Background about the Powhatan Confederacy and the important relationships that developed between Jamestown and the natives. John and a few of the ship's crew befriended Nathaniel Pope and spent time with their family while trading along several plantation tributaries up and down the Potomac River. John forged a particularly strong bond with Pope and ran into families he knew from back in England. Finding much of Virginia's traits appealing, as it was at home in England, minus the tumultuous time there during the English Civil War, John Washington developed misgivings about returning to England, mostly driven by the lack of clarity on his deal with Captain Edward Prescott. Still, he was heading back to England so he could get paid and care for his younger siblings. On their way back out, though, the ship ran aground because of a particularly heavy load of tobacco. Before it could be freed by the changing tide, a winter storm blew in and sunk the ship, ruining the previous cargo. Despite Washington's best efforts to free the ship, he decided to stay in Virginia, but could not get the ship's owner to honor their agreement. They had a falling out, sued each other, and went their separate ways. John stayed behind in Virginia based on the promise of Nathaniel Pope to help Washington gain his footing. There are several long-lasting misunderstandings about the shipwreck and John's motives for staying in Virginia. For example, John's brother Lawrence did not come to Virginia with his brother on the Seahorse of London. Further, John was initially returning to England. His decision to stay came by combination of necessity and choice. It was long believed that John stayed in Virginia because he fell in love with Anne Pope. Well, they didn't marry until a year and a half, 2 years after John settled. It also would not have been with keeping of the traditions of the time. Nathaniel Pope would have practiced what they called his native right to make sure that his daughter married somebody who was successful, wealthy, and could advance the position of the family. At the time, John Washington could not. First, Nathaniel would want to make sure that John lived through a period of seasoning. There was an up to 50% mortality rate at the time. John begins a direct mentorship under Nathaniel Pope and learns about planting tobacco and other staple crops for daily life. Through Nathaniel's other myriad responsibilities to militia and local government, John also listens, learns, and becomes involved in relatively little time. Through connections with those he had known in England and his high aptitude, he takes on some new positions of his own with the militia and alongside Nathaniel's sons, Thomas and Nathaniel Jr., on the plantation. The Pope family had a tumultuous past of their own as part of the rebellion in Maryland, Ingalls Rebellion. Pope had been among the most prominent citizens in Maryland before their falling out with the ruling family of the Maryland colony. About a dozen families had moved across the Potomac onto Virginia's northern neck and remained close friends. These became John's friends and family over time. The complicated and heavily divided responsibilities of government lay the groundwork to understand how later events unfold with such ferocity. Political structure at the time was reactionary and disorganized. Relations between the English colonial government at Jamestown and the dwindling Powhatan Confederacy created dynamics that impacted everyday life. John Washington's brother Lawrence begins traveling back and forth between England and Virginia. Nathaniel Pope and John and Lawrence Washington went into business trading goods direct with English merchants, cutting out middlemen and increasing their own profit margins. John ran into a lot of distant relatives and friends that knew the family back in England. There was a long-standing misunderstanding also that Nathaniel Pope was illiterate. This book disproves that, and it also corrects the misunderstanding about the birth order of his children. Washington accepted his first commission in the militia as a captain and made his way to various small port towns up and down the river. He also developed relations with local natives and worked alongside the popes and their servants during the tobacco planting season. Finally, John becomes involved in financial contracts and political relationships within only months of being in Virginia, both assisting in his own ascent and tying him to Maryland's prominent families and matters of concern to the upper class. The narrative in the book Shipwrecked explains the surroundings and the time period by comparison to the development of art and culture in England and how it made its way to the colonies. John eventually is seen as a suitable husband for Nathaniel and Lucy Pope's daughter, Anne. The role of women in daily life in the colony in the book is well fleshed out, and it sets the stage for the parents to practice their native right and allow for the marriage. What were called banns were read at the church and preparations made for the wedding. Preparations for a wedding between John and Anne take place as conditions in the colony begin to change economically.